Next on Enviro Close-Up, Nukespeak. Welcome to Enviro Close-Up. I am Karl Grossman, and with us is Rory O'Connor, co-author of Nukespeak. Of the books written about nuclear technology through the years, it's among the finest and absolute classic. A new 30th anniversary edition of Nukespeak has just come out as a Kindle edition, and added to its title is The Selling of Nuclear Technology from the Manhattan Project to Fukushima. Yes, it's been updated with 4 new chapters and all of the remarkable original text. Welcome, Rory.
Thank you, Karl. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Rory. The definition of Nukespeak.
Well, Nukespeak is the language of nuclear development. And by that we mean both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And it's obviously a tribute to George Orwell, who in 1984 created the language Newspeak. And Orwell, as you know, Karl, wrote very eloquently on the uses of language for political ends. So what we found in terms of nuclear development, and again, I want to emphasize that's both weaponry and nuclear power production, is that this language of Nukespeak is the language of the nuclear mindset, the worldview of the nuclear developers. And a mindset means exactly what it says, a mind that is already set. So Nukespeak is a language of evasion and of euphemism, a language of sanitizing and minimizing, a language really of promotion and public relations and selling. And what they're selling is the idea that they can make the unacceptable acceptable in the minds of people by controlling the language and thus controlling the very ideas and images and concepts that we can apply to nuclear development.
How did the World War II Manhattan Project, the crash program to build atomic weapons, contribute to this Nukespeak?
Well, one of the primary tenets of Nukespeak is the suppression of information and minimizing certain types of information, as I said, and sanitizing others. Now, the Manhattan Project obviously was developed during a time of world war, of necessity. There was great secrecy and censorship that was applied to the Manhattan Project while they were developing the first atomic weapons. What we found, unfortunately, is that even after those weapons were used, 2 of them, as we must recall, were dropped on the Japanese people, resulting in literally hundreds of thousands of deaths. But after they were used, these same techniques of suppression of information, of minimizing what is said to the public, and of secrecy and of censorship continued to be applied even after the end of the project, after the end of the war, and were transferred from the development of nuclear weapons to the subsequent development of the so-called peaceful atom and nuclear power production.
Now, what was the role of William Lawrence in this nuclear promotion? He was a reporter for the New York Times then.
Well, you know, William Lawrence, as you say, was the star reporter for the New York Times, and he was taken inside the development of the nuclear weapons in the Manhattan Project and given, rather exclusive access. And as remains the case today, reporters for mainstream publications such as the New York Times quite often trade in exchange for that access their independence. So if you look at the reportage of William Lawrence, you're going to find many of the classic terms of Nukespeak applied. For example, he would call the splitting of the atom the beginning of the elixir of life was one of the phrases. It was often compared to the promised land, to a new golden life that awaited us. And one of the things that Lawrence was involved in was helping to make the shift from the awful terror and power of the nuclear weapons that had been dropped on the Japanese people to end World War II, and making the shift from that wartime footing to what came to be known in the early 1950s as Atoms for Peace. Now, as you recall, President Eisenhower first unveiled the Atoms for Peace program in a landmark speech before the United Nations in 1954. And Eisenhower went before the General Assembly and he literally said, "I'm speaking to you today in the words of a new language." So even Eisenhower was nodding to the fact that there was this entire new language of nuclear development. But what we found, and frankly, we think that this word peace, atoms for peace, a peaceful nuclear device to call an atom bomb, for example, which is what the Indians called theirs, the use of the word peace, or I should say actually the misuse of the word peace, comes directly out of a desire on the part of the nuclear developers to essentially assuage their guilt. They had split the atom, they had unleashed this phenomenal and terrible power, the awesome explosiveness of the atom, and they had used it for very destructive purposes. And they felt guilty about this. So in order to assuage their guilt, there was a major effort made to transfer the technology from its destructive application in nuclear weapons into what they truly believed would be a much more productive use of the peaceful atom in order to supply electricity mainly by boiling water. So what you find is that most nuclear power plants are really just a very complex and expensive way of boiling water so that turbines can turn and generate electricity. In addition to going in front of the United Nations and giving this speech, Eisenhower also was photographed, we have images of this in the book, standing with a radioactive wand. And supposedly, of course it didn't actually work this way, but supposedly by waving that wand, he initiated the first nuclear power production in the United States in 1954.
The accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in 1979 was the inspiration for the first edition of the book.
Well, that's correct. And, let's look at that word accident that you just used, because again, this is one of the classics of Nukespeak. In Nukespeak, there is no word accident. Instead, accidents are called transients. They're called events. They're called normal aberrations. They're called anything but what they actually are, which is the word accident. So yes, when 3 Mile Island happened in 1979, again, this was a case where the nuclear developers, because of the nuclear mindset, were literally incapable of imagining what they saw as unimaginable. They didn't have the words, and hence they didn't have the concepts or the ability to imagine that there could be a sequence of events such as happened at 3 Mile Island that may lead to an accident. And as you know, there was a partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island, and we came very close, literally within seconds, of having a full-blown disaster. Not that the accident that happened wasn't a serious one. But of course, the 3 Mile Island accident had been preceded by other incidents, other plant transients, other accidents at other plants, most notably at the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant earlier, which should have indicated to the nuclear developers that the chain of events, which at 3 Mile Island frankly included human error, operating error, they never imagined, even though they had a lot of experience at places like Davis-Besse, where again we came very close to a disaster, even so, in the nuclear mindset, there was no possibility of an accident, there was no word accident, and therefore they couldn't imagine that what happened at 3 Mile Island would ever transpire. But it did. And that's, you're right, that's entirely what gave birth to the original edition of Nukespeak, which was put out in 1981 by Sierra Club Books. I'm very proud to be published by Sierra Club, you know, such an active environmental group, and one that has nearly 1 million members of people who are out there still fighting, you know, the same fight that we were fighting 30 years ago.
Nukespeak has become an international language. How did it figure in the handling of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster in the former Soviet Union?
Well, you know, Chernobyl, again, the second great accident. And, you know, one point that I want to make before I answer your question is that nuclear accidents usually have a very defined beginning, but they rarely have an end. So we now find 25 years after the accident at Chernobyl, the effects are still dire in many, many ways. Chernobyl happened in a country that no longer exists, that is to say the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, later said that he thought that the accident at Chernobyl and the handling of it by the Soviet authorities actually was one of the main contributing factors to the dissolution of the Soviet Union some short years thereafter. Why do I say that? Because again, the Soviet authorities did their best to minimize what was happening. They didn't admit that there had even been an accident at all for more than a day and a half. You know, there was a town only 2 kilometers away from Chernobyl, Pripyat, which was a model Soviet city that had been essentially built to lure people to come and work at the nuclear power plant. Even though there was a terrible explosion and radioactivity was, you know, literally pouring into the air where more than 50,000 people lived at Pripyat, the Soviet authorities didn't tell anyone who lived there for more than 36 hours. And when they finally did, and it's interesting because you can, to this day, hear the audio online in an archive, there was a loudspeaker announcement to the population after 36 hours saying they should consider evacuating because, quote unquote, there was an unfavorable radioactive atmosphere that had resulted from the accident. Now, also the Soviets didn't admit to the world that there had been an accident until a plume of radioactivity went over sensors in nearby Sweden. And the Swedish authorities were about to announce that there had been a nuclear accident. So it really wasn't until they were forced, that they were dragged, kicking and screaming, to actually begin to acknowledge, you know, the terrible reality of what was happening at Chernobyl, did the Soviet authorities, you know, even begin to open up. And as I say, Gorbachev, who later promoted the policy of so-called glasnost, or openness, said that the closed-minded approach to Chernobyl was one of the major contributing factors to the Soviet Union actually breaking up and going entirely out of existence.
How is Nukespeak figuring now in the handling of the Fukushima Daiichi disaster?
Well, you know, once again, we see a major accident, an accident that everybody said couldn't happen, And the same government and industry, and there's rarely much of a difference between the two when it comes to nuclear development. We find that there's always a revolving door, no matter what country, between the so-called regulators and the people in the industry. But to be specific, in Fukushima, the flow of information was suppressed, both by the government and by the industry. For days, they weren't even telling people what was actually happening. They used a lot of euphemism and invasion. For example, there was an explosion at one of the reactors. There were 4 reactors at Fukushima that melted down. When the first one had a hydrogen explosion, what did the government say? Not that there had been an explosion, that there had been a big sound and a puff of white smoke. So I don't know how you can get any more classic Nukespeak than to not call an accident, to not call an explosion an explosion. And finally, I want to point out that just as here in the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's own glossary literally does not contain the word meltdown. Similarly, in Japan, until quite recently, the documents by their regulators didn't include the word tsunami. So if you literally do not have the words to describe these very real events, it makes it much easier for you simply not to be able to imagine that they could ever occur. And this is precisely what happened in Fukushima. In that area of Japan and the northeast coast, very, very common, because it's located in a very active earthquake fault zone, to have both earthquakes and large tsunamis. Historically, going back literally more than 1,000 years, the Japanese have records of very high tsunamis, often of the size of the one that happened in March 2011. So the Japanese authorities were aware of the possibility not only of earthquakes, but of very large tsunamis. In fact, they were so aware that they built a tsunami wall to protect the reactors. One problem: the wall that they built was only 19 feet high. The tsunami wave that came was more than twice as high as it had been in the past. So they literally knew what had happened in the past, but they couldn't imagine that it would happen again. And yet it did, with obviously disastrous, continuing, and long-lasting effects.
You're right in Nukespeak that the nuclear debate is the most important debate in human history. Why?
Well, for 2 reasons. As I said, there's two sides of the nuclear development coin. There's nuclear power and there's nuclear weapons. And one of the things that people like to forget is that we are still living in a hair trigger alert nuclear weapons environment. Both Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, and the United States each still have literally thousands of nuclear weapons that are on a hair trigger alert. And then in addition, if we look on the nuclear power side, let's just look at the effects of these accidents that occur, with regularity, at least one every decade, as we now see. In Chernobyl, for example, 25 years after the accident, we still have no idea literally how many people have died as a result of it. And the estimates range absurdly from several dozen to just under 1 million. In addition, in Chernobyl, they still have no way of capping the radioactivity that's coming out of the site. In fact, they're now building, and here's a great piece of Nukespeak for you, a sarcophagus, in other words, a coffin. This is going to be the largest mobile structure ever built in the world. It's on tracks, and when it's completed, actually, let me say, if it's completed, because it's already 15 years overdue, and the money that was pledged by many, many states in order to build it has yet to materialize. But even if it does get built and slid over on these rails and put on top of the hulking, still radioactive core there, even then, that sarcophagus is only designed to last for 100 years. And as you know, some of these nuclear materials are radioactive for thousands of years. So there literally is no end in sight for both the accident at Chernobyl and the continuing accident at Fukushima.
What can people do about all this?
Well, I think it's important that people realize that they do have the power. It can be a very overwhelming and very depressing to listen to a litany of all the problems that we're facing as a result of nuclear power and nuclear weaponry. But, there is some cause for optimism on both sides. In the nuclear weapons side, for example, there's the so-called zero movement. And we find that many prominent people, very high previous government officials in the United States, and not just liberals or Democrats, but people who were the Secretary of Defense, people who were Secretary of State, such as Henry Kissinger, have all signed on to this movement to try to, over time, in a rational manner, zero out and eliminate entirely nuclear weapons from the world. And the Zero campaign is something that's been very actively supported here in the United States by President Obama. So I think that is a cause for hope. In addition, in the wake of Fukushima, we now find that many countries that had been on a path towards not only continuing but expanding nuclear power are now having second thoughts. There was a referendum not too long ago in Italy where the continued expansion of nuclear power production was roundly defeated by a popular vote. Here in Japan, there were 54 nuclear power plants. As you know, at the moment, only 10 of them are actually operating. But most notably in Germany, the Germans, again, Germany has the largest economy in the European Union, and the Germans have decided to completely eliminate nuclear power production in their country within the next decade. And they've already shut half of their plants, and they're going to shut the other half in the next 10 years, as I said. And in addition, the Germans have decided that they're going to double the amount of electricity that they get from renewables. So I think that, for example, here in the United States, people can take great hope in what's going on around the world. And if the Germans can eliminate nuclear power production, there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't do the same right here in the United States starting today.
You're right about the nuclear promoters saying we have no choice but to build more nuclear power plants. They speak about, as you note, greenhouse gases and global warming.
Well, now here we see the most modern application of Nukespeak. So now that we have all these greenhouse gases and we supposedly want to move away from carbon, promotional groups such as the Nuclear Energy Institute, for example, if you go to their website, you see that nuclear power is now being hailed as a way to fight against climate change. Why? Because it's, quote, clean and green. So they're taking the language of renewable energy and they're applying it to nuclear power production in a very cynical way, in my view.
Cynical? Why?
Because nuclear power is neither clean nor green. For example, at almost every step in the production process for nuclear power, there is waste that is generated. When you mine uranium for electricity use, you're giving off pollutants. But in addition, and we haven't talked about it yet, so let's get to it right now, the key issue around nuclear power production remains the fact that there is no solution to the waste problem. Okay? As you know, thousands of tons of radioactive waste has been generated over the years by these nuclear power plants. And there's been absolutely no progress on having any kind of permanent repository for this waste. So instead, it's been literally piling up at all the nuclear power plants around the country. And as we saw in Fukushima, this is very dangerous as well. In fact, it's even more dangerous in the event of an accident. The waste, the so-called spent fuel, there's another bit of Nukespeak for you, that's even more dangerous in the event of an accident than the actual meltdown of a reactor.
You write frequently in the book about the nuclear promoters referring to themselves as a nuclear priesthood. What are they thinking?
Well, what they're thinking is that they have been ordained somehow, that they are the specialists. They are the only ones who have enough knowledge, who share the secret of this secret brotherhood, and therefore we, the people, should leave the issue of nuclear development entirely to them. Obviously, this is not the case. So I urge people, to go to our website at www.nukespeak.org. Yes, you can buy the book there, but you can also get a lot of information, and you can engage, you can join the conversation, you can educate yourself, and you can get the right words and the right concepts to understand what's going on, and that's the first step to being able to battle against it. And as I said, I'm an optimist. I've seen great change in my lifetime. I've seen Nelson Mandela, for example, go from being a prisoner that no one had ever seen for 20 years to becoming the president of his country. And I could give many, many other examples. So I want to encourage people, not to despair, not to get depressed, but, in the spirit of the Occupy Wall Street movement, it's time for direct democracy. It's time for people to arm themselves with the appropriate language, the appropriate concepts, and then collectively to take the appropriate actions, whether that would be to occupy the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or perhaps to put pressure on both the Democrats and the Republicans. As you know, each party has committed itself to, quote unquote, a nuclear renaissance here in the United States. And President Obama gets a very good grade on the nuclear weapons issue, but I would give him a failing grade when it comes to nuclear power and his continued promotion of it.
You close the book by saying we must change our language and adopt a more explicit and realistic way of speaking and thinking about nuclear issues. Elaborate on that, please.
Well, we begin the book by quoting a linguist, Benjamin Lee Whorf, and he said that a change in language can change our appreciation of the cosmos. So this is where change begins, by calling a spade, by calling an accident an accident, instead of by evading what it really is, by using euphemisms, by minimizing, and by sanitizing. So I think that if people learn to decode the language of the nuclear developers, hopefully it will enable them, as I said, to go on to act collectively, whether it's at the ballot box or whether it's literally by occupying, to take the actions necessary to free us finally from both atoms for war and atoms for peace.
Thank you, Rory O'Connor.
Thank you, Karl. It's been a great pleasure.
And thank you for watching. I'm Karl Grossman. For more information or to view any Enviro close-up program, visit our website at envirovideo.com.